Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Democratic View. I'm the hostess, and my name is Phyllis Italiano. And with me, I have a guy who I have known for a while. His name is Don Matheson, and he is a man who watches our planet and will tell us some very difficult things that we have to become more aware of as our planet faces climate change. Don.
Thank you, Phyllis. I've done a number of programs about climate change, and I'm going to do something that I always save till the end. I'm going to do it first, because that always gets lost in the time thing. And I know we're talking to people in East Hampton, and many of them are already, I'm sure, aware of the danger of climate change and wonder what they can do about it. We happen to live in a town that has taken on the challenge to be net zero energy as fast as we possibly can. And there's on the town website, if people want to go to it, I'll try to hold this so the camera can see it. Energize East Hampton. If you go to the Town of East Hampton website and search for Energized East Hampton, you will find a whole bunch of things that you can do that can A, save you money, and B, help you help the planet. Ways that you can make your house more efficient, ways that you can do many things. So Energize East Hampton, I want to make sure that nobody misses that. Write it down now, because it's probably more important than anything I have to say for you to avail yourself of the things that the town has done to try to save the planet. Another thing you could do is look at the Drawdown Project, which is there's a very active group here in East Hampton, and this is a project and a study. It's 100 different things that people can do to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Drawdown. So write that down. If you're interested in getting involved, that's a good group to look up. Their website, just type in Drawdown and it'll take you to the national organization and help you connect to the people locally. Whenever anybody talks about climate change, whenever you listen to anybody talking about climate change, always find out who they are and what their background, what their interests are. I'm a nobody. I'm not even a scientist. I was a builder here for 26 years, and I built some energy efficient houses because I developed an interest in it. And this stack of books here, I don't know if the camera is focused. There, you can see it now. This stack of books, they're all books that I've read about climate change over the last 30 years. Not being a scientist, surely there are parts of them that I don't even understand. But I can understand the conclusions, and I know who's talking in each one of these books. And I'm going to tell you a little story about the importance of knowing who's talking when you hear somebody say something about climate change. This was maybe 15 years ago. I was at a dinner party. I was already an activist on climate change, and I had expounded at length on the dangers of it and what I knew about it. And another person who was there, a friend of mine, a very nice man, a giving man, a smart man. He was a college professor in physics. And he sort of, after we had gotten up and were milling around, elbowed me off to the side and he said, "You know, Don, not everybody agrees with what you're saying. I'm going to connect you with a college professor, a geologist who knows a lot about this stuff. And I'm going to connect him up with you." Sure enough, a couple days later, I get an email from this geology professor that I have never met. And he said, "Our mutual friend told me that you're interested in this, and I thought these articles and papers might be useful to you." And there were 3 papers there. Well, I was not new at this stuff even then, 15 years ago. And I almost immediately recognized the names and the organizations behind the articles. They looked very official and very scientific, but they were all papers. The original source, if you went back, was the Heartland Institute, which calls itself a think tank. You can give them money, they're nonprofit, but they're really funded by ExxonMobil.
Oh, God.
And all of these papers explained why contemporary climate science was, I'm not going to say what these papers said they were full of, but they were trying to convince the reader that climate change was not real, it was nothing to worry about, we should all just continue to do things the way we are.
I wish.
Now, that guy who recommended this geology professor was a good man. He did not know that he was giving me false information. I happen to know that the Heartland Institute got millions of dollars from ExxonMobil expressly to create and disseminate false information about climate change in defense of their profits. The fossil fuel industry is the richest industry in the world, and much of their stock value is based on things that are in the ground still. And they don't want anybody to tell them we shouldn't use it. And they spend a lot of money on politicians and fake science, and they disseminate it to newspapers and magazines and individuals all over the world. So any conversation about climate change, you should recognize this. Can we see that? How do I hold it? Maybe you can't read it. I'll read it to
Yes.
you. The money never sleeps. No matter how many studies scientists have done about climate change, the money keeps trying to disprove it. Donald Trump, Donors Trust, DT, Donors Trust in 2018 was one slush fund with revenue in that 1 year of $202,776,000. $202,776,000. Their net assets after their expenses of $144 million was $244 million. Where it came from and where it goes is impossible to fathom because of Citizens United. They passed laws so that these people can subvert climate science. They promise their donors that only groups with an extreme anti-environmental agenda will get any of this money. So realize that when somebody says, oh, scientists disagree, I'll tell you, the only disagreement among climate scientists is whether we can save this world before it's too late. So with that, I want to start with just by discussing a couple of the most common things that you will hear from people who say that climate change is nothing to worry about. The first thing they'll say is, the weather has always changed. There have always been cycles. It goes up, it goes down. We have ice ages, it gets real hot, alligators in Alaska. It's always changed. The best lie is one that starts with a nugget of truth. If you can see this graph right here to my left, there are fine lines here that oscillate up and down in yellow, and then this solid yellow line is an 11-year moving average of those readings. And what those readings are is total solar irradiance. In other words, how much is the sun warming the Earth? It varies because the Earth over a period of time wobbles. Its path around the sun is sometimes round, and then sometimes it gets a little elliptical, so
Yes.
it's a little bit farther away,
Yes.
and it rocks on its axis. Well, Those are the cycles they're talking about, solar irradiance. What they don't tell you is those wobbles are on a span of, like, one of them is on 41,000 years. One of them is on 27,000 years. And they will say, well, actually, we're in a period of solar irradiance where the Earth is getting colder. And that's true. We're 6,000 years into a 40,000 year oscillation. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with what we're seeing with climate change. Climate change it's not on a 41,000. This chart goes back to 1880. And you can see the solar irradiance from like 1960 on has been going downward, suggesting that we would be getting colder. But in fact, the degrees Celsius of warming is going up. It's gone up 1 degree since where it always has been in the time that man has been on Earth. And the reason for that is this. This is the carbon dioxide level in parts per million. And it goes back 800,000 years. Now, people might say, how do they know that? Well, I can tell you that science is extremely specialized. They wouldn't say that if one guy had said it. There are thousands, millions of scientists all over the world who've been trying to figure out these things since science began. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has never gone above this line of 300 parts per million. Only in 1950 did it suddenly shoot up. And people will say, the deniers will say, oh, well, there are a lot of ways that carbon dioxide gets in the atmosphere. Termites put out a lot of carbon dioxide. But scientists, clever guys that they are, guys and gals, they can actually take a molecule of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and look at its fingerprint and know whether it came from fossil fuel or from a burning tree. They don't make these statements lightly. And what happens is somebody they say, notice it's getting warmer, say. So they say, why is it? And they look at all of the things that all of the different branches of scientists have come up with. One of them, they know it's the makeup of the atmosphere. Nobody objected to carbon dioxide being an agent of keeping the Earth warm. We've always known that the atmosphere was like a blanket on the Earth. And we knew that carbon dioxide was a major factor. It's only when it began to threaten the profits of the fossil fuel companies, when supercomputers came around and they could begin to do simulations and analyze all the data from thousands of instruments all over the world, that suddenly people began to question whether man-emitted carbon dioxide was what was causing the problem. This level since 1950 and where it is now has raised the temperature, as I said before, and we saw on the other chart, 1 degree. People say, what's 1 degree? Look it up. You can go to the NOAA or NASA websites, and you'll find that the last ice age, where we live now was covered with glaciers, the world temperature was only 6 degrees cooler than it is today. And scientists are telling us, I'll interrupt myself and bring up another myth. In 2018, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is 600 of the world's top climate scientists from every country in the world, basically, came out with a statement that said, we have 12 years, they were talking in 2018, 12 years to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 45% if we hope to keep it below 1.5 degrees. And it's very important that we do that. Well, since that came out, there have been a lot of people saying, oh, now the IPCC is saying that the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't reduce emissions by 45%. Pooh-pooh that. Nobody believes that. Well, it's true. Nobody does believe that, and that's not what they said. What they said is if you want to keep it to 1.5 degrees above normal, we have to reduce carbon emissions by 45% between now and 2030. And the reason that's important is because the disasters get infinitely worse beyond 1.5 degrees. If you go to 2 degrees, it gets worse than that. 3 degrees, it gets worse than that. And yes, if you get to 4 or 5 degrees, much of the world becomes unfit for human habitation. Now, what scientists do is they do these calculations and then they go back to the world to see, do my theories make sense? And we are already seeing that we are not approaching serious climate change. We're in the midst of serious climate change. And the problem is that heat causes heat. What do I mean by that? We've already seen that they're now talking about shipping lanes that go between North America and the Arctic, because there used to be sea ice that made it too clogged with ice to be able to do shipping there. Exxon has gone up there and tried to drill for more petroleum. Wherever they think they can go, they will. But what happens when you make the ice cap smaller? The ice cap is like a mirror for incoming solar heat. It's called, the reflectivity of the Earth is called the albedo. The sun hits the ice cap and bounces back into space so that it doesn't warm the planet. Well, we've already made the ice cap smaller. So now more of the sun is hitting the dark ocean and land. Because it's not just the ice caps, it's also glaciers all over the world in the mountains. Snowpack, you've heard that the snowpack out west is much less, so they're running out of water. They rely on the snowpack in the mountains for water in California and Colorado and Wyoming and all those western states. So as the snow everywhere and the ice caps disappear, more of the sun's heat comes in and can't get out because of the carbon dioxide increasing, which makes a blanket. So we've made it hotter, and now we have what's called a feedback, the albedo, the reflectivity of the sun's heat. Less of it is going back into space now, so that's causing more heat. Or you talk about fires. You remember last year, Australia had fires like they've never had before. For months, we kept hearing about these terrible fires, horrible human tragedy. Now we have the same thing. In fact, 2019 was one of the worst forest fire years in California, but 2020 is even worse. And let me tell you what that means. Over the first 9 months of 2019, let me see if I've got this. Double-sided visual aids. Another thing people will claim is they'll say, oh, you tell us it's going to get wetter, but the hurricanes haven't gotten any worse. Bull something. Disasters, weather disasters in the USA costing more than $1 million. Billion dollars. In the decade of the 80s, that's 80 to 89, there were 28 of them, an average of 2.8 a year, costing $127 billion. In the 90s, there were 52 of them, costing $269 billion. In the 2000s, there were 59 of them, costing $510 billion. In the 2010s through 2019, there were 119 of them, costing $802 billion, $80 billion a year. 2015 to 2019, in other words, just showing you it's continuing to get worse, that's in this same decade, there were 44 of them, or an average of 14.7 a year. But January to September of this year, there were 16 of them already, and we're still in the hurricane season. I just read that there's another one forming in the Atlantic now. We don't know if it'll hit the United States. But what that is all of this heat is causing more heat. And what can happen after that? The albedo is one thing, but there's also methane. And in the Arctic, there are billions of tons of methane that's frozen in the tundra or just below the surface. Methane is 30 times as bad as CO2, but for a shorter time period. The reason we focus on CO2 is because once that gets there, it's going to be there for centuries. Methane might only last 30 years, but it's going to produce a lot of heat if we get hot enough to melt those clathrates, as they call them, that hold so much methane in the Arctic. And then that's going to make it even hotter. So in other words, you hear people say, well, with climate change, well, this is the new normal now. No, it's not the new normal. It's the beginning of a downhill slide that will only stop if humans stop doing what they're doing. When you look at the IPCC reports and try to say, well, what's going to happen by 2100 in terms of sea level rise? Sea level rise is really not the biggest problem with climate change. Bill McKibben, one of our most valuable savants who's been writing about it for years and years, said climate change is really about whether you eat or don't eat. But just on sea level rise, which people tend to say, so we have to build some seawalls, and they say by 2100, there could be somewhere between 1 foot and 8 feet of sea level rise. Well, that's not very specific. Which is it going to be? The answer is they can't answer that because they don't know what people are going to do. If we started today and did everything that we could do, we could probably hold it to 1 foot. Probably, not for sure. 1 foot of sea level rise by 2100. But if we don't, it could be 8 feet by 2100. And these are people. These aren't gods, scientists. They're doing the best they can. And already, they've had plenty of surprises where things have turned out worse than they thought. How much time do we have?
We have about a minute, so.
Okay, well, I want to turn one other thing over and tell you why this is important. What you do at home, if you go to Energize East Hampton, as I asked, can have a significant effect if enough of us participate. But nothing you do can have as much effect as how you vote. Donald Trump says that I don't think science knows. I think it's going to start getting cooler. Well, there are, that's why I said it's important to know who you're listening to. If you talk to scientists who actually study it, I'm talking the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Chemical Society, the American Geophysical Union, American Physical Society, international academies, joint statements. This thing I just printed out a few pages. It has hundreds of societies, and they all say the same thing.
Okay, we're almost over, so what should we do right now?
Do not ever vote for a Republican. They're wholly owned by the fossil fuel industry.
Okay.
Lee Zeldin included, he says, I'm fighting to protect our environment on Long Island. His voting
You know
record
what? We're
is
over.
77 bad and 7 good.
We're over anyway.